Hello and welcome to the 6th lesson in the Intermediate Java class. Today we'll be going over ArrayLists in Java and some of the things you can do with them. And so without further ado, let's just get started. So let's start by introducing what ArrayLists are. Just like arrays, they are a collection of values. They can store multiple values of a certain data type. And each item is called an element, just like for an array. And to refer to a certain spot in an array list, you would use the term index, just like for an array. The difference between an array list and an array is that array lists do not have a specific size. So you can actually change the size of an array list after you create it. This makes them really useful in certain scenarios. Another difference is that an array list is a class, and it does have methods, whereas an array does not have methods and is not a class. To create an array list, you first need to remember to import the ArrayList class. So you would have to import java.util.ArrayList at the beginning of your code. After that, you would have to decide what type of value you want the list to hold. So ArrayList cannot hold primitive data types directly. So let's look at the following chart. Rather than holding an int or a double or a char, you would use an array list to hold the corresponding classes. So integer class, the double class, or the character class, or in the case of Boolean, the Boolean class. So for each primitive type, you would have to use the corresponding class to create your array list. String is already a class, so you don't have to do this. Array lists can only hold types that are classes. So to create an array list, you would start by saying array list, then you would put the type, or in this case integer, in two greater than and less than sign. So you would start by putting a less than sign, the type, in this case an integer, greater than sign, then you put the name of the object, just as you always would. Then you put an equal sign, new, using the new keyword to create a new object, and then you would use ArrayList, integer, and then parentheses, and then a semicolon to initialize a new array list that holds integers using the constructor. So now let's get into some of the things you can actually do with array lists. So ArrayList has a method called add. So you can use .add on any object that you created with the ArrayList class to add one object to the ArrayList. So .add takes in one parameter, the element that you want to add, and it adds that element to the end of the list. So for example, let's say that you had this array list of strings, and it's called friend list, and it's a new array list of type string. So if you call friendslist.add5, or if you add, or in this case, it's actually a string. So if you called friendslist.add Jerry and then friendslist.add Bill, you would get Jerry in the first place, or in the with index 0, because you added it first. So it adds it to the end of the list, which is at position 0. Then when you added Bill, it would add to the end of the list again, which is now at position 1. If you tried to add 5, friendslist.add5, it would not work because 5 is an int or an integer and is not a string. This would throw an error. So to add at a specific index, you can also use that add method, except with two parameters, the index and then the element. This adds the element that you specify at the index that you specify. One thing to remember is that you cannot add to an index that doesn't exist. So let's look at an example. Let's say you had the array list of strings friends list is equal to a new array list of strings. and you added at position 0 Frank. If it started in this at this position that you can see in the table, the final output will be Frank at position 0, then Jerry at position 1, you can see that everything got shifted, and then Bill at position 2. So it shifts all the elements that are after the element that you want to add over by one position, and then it puts Frank at the position that you want. Or in this case it was Frank, but in general the element that you're adding. So to access elements, you use the get method. So the get method takes in one parameter, the index of the element that you want to get. So let's say you started with this array list. Again, we're using friends list. If it started out at this initial position, or at this initial setting, so Frank is at position or index 0, Bill is at index 1, Michael is at index 2, and Sally is at index 3, and you set string oldest friend to friendslist.getZero, what this is doing is it's getting the element at index 0. So if we look at the table, we can see that in index 0 is Frank. So friendslist.getZero will be Frank. So string oldest friend or oldest friend will be set to Frank. So notice that if we try to input friendslist.getFor, it cannot access that index because friendslist only has indexes up to 3. So this is a very common error where you would put friendslist.getFor trying to get the last element since it's of size 4. But you have to remember that indices start at 0, so they end at 1 less than the actual size of the array list. So the last index would be 3 rather than 4. If you tried putting a higher index like 5, it would also not work because that index does not exist. So to remove an element from an array list, you would use the remove method. This removes an element and shifts everything to fill in the spot. So you pass in an int, and that specifies the index which will be removed. And of course it must be a valid index, so it must be within the bounds of the array list, so between 0 and 1 less than the size of the array list. So let's look at this example where the array list holds Frank at position 0 or index 0, Jerry at index 1, and Bill at index 2. If we said friendslist.remove Jerry, this would be the final output. Frank at position 0 and then Bill at index 1. If you try doing friends.alist.remove 1, you would get just Frank. So notice that you can specify either the element or the index. To find a certain index of a certain element in an array list, you can use the indexOf method. The indexOf method accepts an element and then it will return the index of that element, just like it would if you tried using it on a string object. So it either returns the index of that element or it would return -1 if it's not found. This is very useful because if you are checking to see if a certain element exists in an array list, you can simply check if the output when you do indexOf is -1. If it is -1, then you know that the array list does not contain that element. So let's look at an example of using indexOf. Let's say you started with this initial setting. So Frank at index 0, Bill at index 1, Michael at index 2, and Sally at index 3. If you did Bill index, an int is equal to friendslist.indexOfBill, then it will set Bill index to 1. The reason for this is because if we look in that table, we can see that Bill has index 1. So Bill index, which is the index of Bill, will be set to 1. Now let's look at modifying elements. we can use the set method to change a certain index or change a certain element at a certain index to a new element. So let's say we start with this friends list or an array list of strings that's called friends list. Let's say we have this following initial setting: Frank at index 0, Bill at index 1, Michael at index 2, and Sally at index 3. If we do Bill index is friends list dot index of Bill, it will find the index of Bill and set it to Bill index. So we will get Bill index is equal to 1. Now if we set Bill index to Billy, we will essentially be replacing Bill with Billy. So this is what you can see by the following arrow. You can see at index 1, we initially had Bill. Then we got the index, so Bill index was turned to 1, or set to 1, and then we set friends list at index 1 to Billy. So we set friends list at Bill index, which was 1, to Billy. So you can see that it changed from Bill to Billy in the array list. So now let's look at printing an array list. So one way to do this is that you can loop through the array list and print each value manually. This is useful in some cases when you want to, for example, output some certain text with what you're printing. So how you would loop through this is you would get the size of the array list using the .size method, and then you would use a for loop. So you can see we started at int I equals 0, so our I, or counter variable, is starting at 0. We check if it's always less than the size of the array, and if it's not, we keep cycling through and printing out the next element. And we change I by 1 to get to the next element. So another way to do this is that you can actually just print out the ArrayList object. So in this case, we had friends list, but we can just print it directly. So we could do system.out.println friends list, and this would print out what we wanted. So why would you use the for loop? Of course, because let's say you wanted to type or use a certain different format for printing than printing them out directly in a list format. Then you would use a loop to print out in the format that you want to print out. It gives you more control over how you want to print out friends list. So we saw that you can use a for loop to go through an array or an array list. But rather than use a for loop, you can also use a for each loop. So this is slightly different than a for loop because there's no index variable, and a variable is just used to cycle through all the elements in the array list. It works for arrays too. So let's look at it right now. So the structure of a for each loop is, again, it starts out with for, just like a for loop, but rather than having something like int I, int j, or any type of int or an initialization, you declare a variable string friend, which is going to represent the current element, and then you're going to put a colon and then friends list. So how you would read this is for every friend in friends list, then you would do the following operation. So what operation we want to do is between those two brackets. So specifically here we want to print them out. So we would just say system.out.println friend, and that would print out that specific friend. But since we're using a for each loop, this cycles through every friend in friends list, so it would print out every friend in friends list, and each on a separate line, because we're using system.out.println. So the way you would read this in total is you would say for each friend in friends list, print out friend. Alright, so for today's exercises, you're going to want to first start by creating a program that gives you the average of the values in an array list. So you should start by creating an array list of obviously integers or doubles, or some kind of type that holds integers, or not integers, or numeric values. and you're going to want to average all the values in that array list. Then write another method that reverses the elements in an array list. So it takes in an array list as a parameter and then it returns a new array list, which essentially reverses all the elements. Finally, for your third exercise, write a program that asks for the user to give as many names as they want to give and keep adding these names into an array list. When they enter done to stop collecting names, then print out all the names in the array list in a random order. And for using the random order, you can use the following hint, use math.random. And so that basically concludes today's lesson on array lists. We hope you enjoyed. We'll see you at the next lesson.